As part of our misinformation and disinformation series, we're turning our attention to legacy media.
Which, of course, includes the BBC. So how does an organisation all about trust retain it when people don't trust institutions?
From The Attention Practice and Phonogram, this is the podcast all about the attention economy. Welcome to Can We Have Your Attention? Hello, James.
Hello, Claire.
So, we have a few more listeners.
Well, that's nice to know.
Welcome.
Isn't it? Excellent.
Welcome.
Nice to have you along for this.
Yes, a few people reached out and went Swedish listeners, which I enjoyed.
What, they were surprised that we had Swedish listeners? Or we have
they
listeners
were a little
everywhere.
Surprised. I know we have listeners everywhere. We've got listeners in Asia. We've got listeners in the United States. We've got listeners all around Europe, Africa. It's amazing. It's amazing.
Do you know what these listeners aren't doing, though, Claire? Do you know what they're not doing enough of?
James, they can do no wrong.
Well, you say that. What they're not doing is giving us enough 5-star ratings because it's all about the algorithms.
Oh, but first, thank you to everyone who has given us a 5-star rating. It really does make a huge difference.
I love
but yes,
it.
Please give us more.
This is like good cop, bad cop, isn't it?
It is.
Like Claire's like, would you mind, orphan? Please give us. I'm trying. Give us a rating. Give us them. Anyway,
it's our dynamic, our healthy dynamic.
Yeah, I like it. I think it works really well. So this particular program you're about to listen to is all about really the BBC, and it's part of what has become our own little story arc. I think, Claire, do you want to explain a bit more, because we are misinforming and disinforming? We
are misinforming and disinforming. Not just that, we're looking into everything that is galvanizing attention and making people feel a little bit overwhelmed. And as part of that, of course, we've talked to Tom Garnett from Refute, which was a great episode on misinformation and disinformation in elections. We talked to Stephen Lacey about the drivers of populism so that we could help understand what people are responding to when they see this information, because, of course, it plays into a worldview and more likely feelings that already exist. This week, we're talking to Rebecca Skippage, who's the former disinformation editor of the BBC. And this was someone that James came across. James, do you want to talk a little bit about why we've invited her on?
Well, I just thought it was a fascinating thing to hear from somebody who was so heavily involved within the BBC's own efforts to look at, to counter, to understand disinformation and misinformation. But I thought also it was just interesting to get her perspective on the media, because a lot of what we've talked about are political aims. They are about understanding different policy areas or whatever. I think actually one of the things we haven't looked at that much yet really is the media and its role in it, and the kind of constraints and safeguards and institutional problems that, befall it when it comes to trying to adapt so quickly. Look, I think it's a really interesting conversation. Let's get straight to Rebecca and hear what she has to say.
My name's Rebecca Skippage. I'm formerly the BBC's Global Disinformation Editor, and I'm now a consultant that works with companies looking at understanding the information ecosystem, how and why everyone believes disinformation, and how to counter it.
Rebecca, we've had the conversation about the BBC already on our call, so we don't need to do the how have you survived escaping chat again on air. But I do want to ask you, is being the BBC's Global Disinformation Editor one of the most difficult jobs around at the moment?
Yes and no. I mean, people used to look at the disinformation team and say, God, you're all very upbeat, aren't you? You're all very positive. And we were and we are a kind of, a group of very sort of positive, optimistic individuals, because we felt that we were making a difference. There is this huge, huge issue out there, but we felt that we were sort of, facing it and doing something about it. So there is an element of kind of utility and sense of kind of mission in doing it, which, again, you'll know as somebody who's worked at the BBC that's really important to those of us that work in the public sector. But it's really hard at the same time because for a variety of reasons. What used to happen when I started at the BBC 25 plus years ago is that people were kind of impressed by that, and they felt that it was this kind of great bastion of truth. And now it doesn't matter who you speak to. There's a sense that the BBC is kind of part of the institutional conspiracy, and we sit around in corners and work out how we can sort of, fool people, and we are not trusted anymore. And then you say you work in disinformation, and there's a sort of wry laugh from people, what sort of spreading it type of thing. So it felt very important and it felt valuable, but at the same time, yeah, quite a tough sell on many issues, on many levels.
I have done a lot of sitting in corners in the BBC, but that's mostly trying to hide away from doing as much work as I could possibly get away with, which I know wasn't the case in your case.
No, it used to make me laugh at the idea. I mean, once again, I really love the organisation, but the idea we'd be organised enough to sit around and work out a sort of parallel agenda whilst we were just trying to kind of get the news out the door as best we could.
That's the thing that's always baffled me, the idea that anyone thinks we've got time to organise anything, or indeed the ability to organise anything. But do you think the BBC has not done enough, or is in some way complicit in the way that disinformation seems to have spread in the last few years?
I think complicit is putting it too harshly. I think that it could have done more. I think that disinformation is a kind of defense and offense game. And I think the defense has been quite strong. I think the fact that I started the first disinformation team in 2018 and was the first person doing that. And certainly for the first year or so, it was a really tough sell. We were sort of having to say to people, this is a thing. Information manipulation is a thing. But then there was investment in it and it grew. And certainly COVID kind of helped that cause, so to speak, because it became clear that this wasn't just a case of, a fact checking or something like that, which is perfectly, useful. But this was a case of, people's health, people's lives were being impacted by disinformation. I think BBC Verify has been, a fantastic development. There are some absolute world-class people in there that as far as their knowledge of not only open source intelligence techniques are concerned, but their knowledge about the environments and the countries that often is pushing out this disinformation. I think where perhaps the BBC could have done more, and I understand that there were sort of commercial reasons for this not to happen, is that there has been this sense of trying to draw people always onto the BBC's infrastructure to keep them within the kind of the walled garden. Whereas actually what my view has always been is that you have to go fishing where the fishes are. You have to be on these places and these platforms where the disinformation is. And I think that structurally has been an issue. Sort of you're seeing it more, but unfortunately, sort of simultaneously, there was this erosion of trust in institutions. And now when you see the BBC on TikTok or whatever, I think it's kind of a little bit late for that. They should have been faster to it. And sometimes also when you see it, it feels as though, again, it's that slightly kind of corporate, awkward, inauthentic way of presenting things. Whereas actually these platforms are all about being quite raw and sort of people to people speaking. And that sort of sense that you're a person interacting with another thing. And that is absolutely anathema for the BBC. And I do understand why it happened, but it does feel kind of frustrating that they didn't get ahead of that.
This is slightly granular, but bear with me. Does the nature of the BBC itself mean that it really struggles to deal with tackling that disinformation in the way you say? And what I'm thinking about specifically is every piece of information that goes out from the BBC should be double checked, has to go through an editorial agenda. There are legions of middle managers who have particular resources they all need to think about. It makes it really hard, doesn't it? When you say, you've got a platform like TikTok, which needs a very personal approach, trying to provide that within the BBC. From my own experience, I think that's almost impossible.
Yeah, I think there are two things there. I think as far as kind of fact checking is concerned, that needs to have the time taken that it does. I think you need to be, particularly when you're countering disinformation, you need to be right about what you're saying. And I think that one of the things that when Verify started, the then head of news, Deborah Turness, said, it's fine to say we don't yet know. And I could see people twitching in the room because, again, that's not the way that, that the BBC typically operates. But I think kind of having that sense of we are looking at this, we have seen that it is going viral, or we have seen this footage coming in, but we are checking it and we don't yet know is an absolutely decent position to have. However, when you're going on to this idea of, getting your most charismatic performers, your most knowledgeable people sort of out there and countering things, you've got to be agile. And the BBC ain't that. And it's really difficult. I mean, somebody years ago said to me, it's like an oil tanker. It moves slowly, but when it does, it really makes, sort of considerable headway. And yeah, the BBC is not agile enough in this area, in my view. And it's really interesting when you see people like, Amal Rajan, who is, I think, a really good litmus test for these sorts of things, because he's a very sort of smart operator and really understands the media. When he's kind of, left the BBC to start his own thing as, effectively a kind of news creator, albeit a quite, a very high profile one. And people like Fergal Keane are, doing that as well. You think, okay, I think the tide has turned. And, they've got so many incredibly brilliant, charismatic, excellent people. And I don't mean people who are 25. I mean, I've said this before, but, Jeremy Bowen is an absolute case in point. Brilliant operator, amazingly knowledgeable, fantastically charismatic. Heaven's sake, stick him on TikTok or something and get him to talk about stuff. You've got folk who are sort of, more senior journalists and from some of the legacy publications in the States that do this. And they get really, really good figures because people are drawn to people who are knowledgeable and charismatic and interesting and know how to tell the story. And the BBC is just stuffed full of those. So for heaven's sakes, get them on.
That is interesting. This is a total side note, but when I first started working in advertising many years ago, it was just at that time you could start to see, you could do things like eye tracking or you could do engagement tracking with videos. And one of the very first things I noticed was that any frame that contained a face or a person was just instantly the thing that people zeroed in on. People have this preference for seeing other people. They trust people. They don't necessarily trust objects or other things. Now, brands, take on certain characteristics that are like a person, right? Rebecca, in previous conversations, we've talked about Fairy, for example. People have a very clear image in their mind of what kind of person Fairy is. But it feels like the BBC is stuck in that place between being a really established mega brand that has a personality, and that's not a personality that feels like it's aged well, versus being a corporation that houses a lot of personalities that can build that trust. And I wonder if there's struggle to make those two elements work together.
I think that's a really, really good point. I mean, the BBC used to be known as Auntie B. And I think that worked for maybe those times when it was a sort of benign but sort of slightly senior figure. But that top-down way of communicating has long passed. And that sort of, we know that peer-to-peer is where it's at. And yet you have to do it, and I'm going to use that word again, with authenticity. And I think that the BBC really, really struggles to do that. I think there's a real identity crisis within it. And I think perhaps with news, it's harder than in many other divisions within the BBC for it to kind of work out where it sits. But it needs to find its voice. And, Matt Britton, the new Director General, who is a really good, really, really bright, able guy, I think he could do worse than sort of sit down and, in the same way that when you think about an audience, you think about one person, and say, okay, who is it that we're trying to broadcast to? Who is it we're trying to reach? And what is the voice of the BBC? He could do a lot worse than trying to kind of to work that out, because you cannot be all things to all people. You end up being a sort of rather kind of grey, beige type of character that no one's really interested in.
It sounds like it's almost confused the mandate a little bit between serving people and, as you say, serving everyone at the same time.
Yeah, and it's kind of, famously you can't please all the people all the time, but you can't broadcast to all the people all the time either. And there are all sorts of, ideas as far as how the BBC sort of future-proofs itself. And it's going to be really interesting, because the next, what we used to call charter renewal, but I think that might be, if only it were that simple, is happening at the end of 2027. So at the moment, there are kind of green papers and white papers and all the things being traded between the DCMS, the Department for Culture, Media and Sport, and the BBC, working out what a BBC that is fit for purpose for the next 10 years looks like. And if I can give my sort of 2 cents worth, it needs to specialise in the areas where not only does it really shine, but also where it offers something that others do not. And I think news is absolutely, its kind of key offering. And, increasingly in a world which, doesn't agree on sort of simple facts, that there's this absolute sort of atomization of the community. And increasingly, I think that will happen even more when you bring in things like augmented reality and agentic AI and things like that. We need the BBC to be, at the very least, the place that you can go to find, factually accurate, timely, engaging, accessible news. And then also that kind of deep dive stuff that you get from all of the expertise that it has. I mean, should it be doing Strictly Come Dancing? I mean, it's a fantastic ratings juggernaut, and it brings in an audience that, pays the license fee. And so, it serves that chunk of it. So it's all kind of tied up with this universality that they have to produce if they're going to have a license fee. And they've sort of got slightly locked into that and sort of slightly kind of pushed into a corner, I think. But you can't suggest that there might not be a universal license fee. Really, at the BBC, that's sort of like sacrilegious. But I think they really do need to see, what a future looks like when actually they're producing sort of a narrower offering, but doing it, exceptionally well. James, what do you think?
Well, I just think if you ask everybody in the BBC, they'll have a slightly different approach to it, really. I
Yeah.
think depending on where they are. And the thing that you said there that I thought was really interesting was around the fact that nobody agrees on facts anymore. And that's absolutely true. And I wondered where you felt as a society how that's happened. Are people scared? Are people don't know what to look at anymore, what to trust?
I think there's a huge element of that. I think with disinformation, there are kind of a variety of different reasons that people kind of believe things and sort of promote them and amplify them on basically social media, but also, within, WhatsApp groups and just sort of chatting to people. Some of it, and I think this is a really interesting bit, is about social clout. So there's a really fascinating study that's just been done in Nature magazine. And it's about how if you are in a small group of people, even if you're kind of tangentially related to them, you want to reinforce your own position within that by echoing and amplifying the views of that group. So it doesn't necessarily matter if it's true, but if if the prevailing thought within that group is that the BBC is rubbish and you see a meme that, says something along those lines, you are likely to kind of, to put it in there because that gives you more social clout. And, don't underestimate that as far as, a motivation for people. But I think the kind of the larger stuff, the more sort of malign stuff, which undermines, democracy and health and people's sense of kind of societal relationships and social cohesion very often comes from a position of fear. We are living in a world which is really, really unstable and uncertain. And when that happens, and I know you've spoken to Stephen Lacey about this, who is a brilliant on it, you get this thing which they call the Great Retreat. So people kind of, move into themselves and become much more interested just in their, in their families and their domestic life, and much less kind of concerned about what happens internationally. And I think when people feel uncertain, they feel unstable, what they're looking for is certainty and is strong answers. And if you look to people such as the kind of the right wing and certainly the sort of the more populist people, they give absolutely straight, certain answers, not necessarily the truth, very often not the truth, but they just keep repeating the same thing over and over and over again. And they are always there to say it in a really simple way. And that, I think people want those sorts of answers. They want to feel that there is a reason behind COVID, or the system is actually stacked against me, or an incomprehensible tragedy does have a sort of a hidden hand behind it. That gives you a sense of, okay, there is a structure within the world. And so it's perfectly understandable why people sort of believe this, and then necessarily they sort of believe the facts that kind of underpin that. But it does mean that you get a situation where those people who are, I suppose, more comfortable in living in that sense of uncertainty, and those who have believed the certainties that are kind of offered to them, have this absolutely conflicting notion of actually what happened. And it's really difficult to build a society, to build a democracy without that sense of we believe in certain things, because you can't argue, you can't have a sort of a debate or a democratic sort of situation if you don't believe in certain things as being factually accurate. So it's incredibly concerning. It's very unsettling. It's really difficult to know how you move on from that. And that's even before you get into augmented reality and generative AI, fiddling around with things. So actually, even the evidence that you used to be able to look to, as far as, well, we know, this happened because we've got, evidence of it, that now can be manipulated. So we are in a really very odd and precarious situation.
So I want to pick up on this thread for the moment, because I think What we're fundamentally talking here is about trust and belonging. And especially as the world feels like it's getting more uncertain, it is getting more uncertain, you feel like you're less in control, that sense of trust and belonging becomes more important. Now, if I think about this from everything I've learned from brands and how you persuade people to buy or try a new product, or even just stay with the one they have, there's two different ways of exploring this. And sometimes you do it simultaneously, right? So one is thinking about your messaging, right? It comes down to simplicity, repetition, and consistency. You do not move or change anything unless you absolutely fundamentally have to. But from a messaging standpoint, you can see how populist movements dial into that, right? Like Nigel Farage has been banging this drum for 40 years. Nothing fundamentally has changed about what he said. He is nothing if not consistent. Narrow, but consistent. But on the other side, what you do get then is if you have, say, a more complex brand or that has more offerings, ease of use becomes everything. Ease of access, ease of use. And it feels like the BBC is stuck in two things at the moment where it isn't or can't quite do both things, right? So one is in a time where we're very focused on facts and truth, repetition, consistency, simplicity may not be how you deliver information. But on the other side, the reason there's a rise of AI, people don't even trust AI, but yet they're using it for news, even though they know they shouldn't, even though they know it's not fully trustworthy, because it's just slightly easier, right? It's good enough. And it feels like the BBC have gotten trapped in this thing where they're trying to make both the information that it delivers by its nature probably is more complex. I don't know if there's much more you can do to simplify it. But the actual journey, what they're expecting, is complex for what they actually need. And I'm not sure it serves the public mandate. I don't know what you think about that. I've just thrown that out there like, this is my opinion, but
No, I think you're right. And I think that there is this focus on the user, the customer, the consumer having to do the work. There are tools that you can use to see if something is AI. You should look at the sources and all the rest of it.
Yeah.
I mean, for heaven's sakes.
That's the job of a journalist. That's your
Right,
job, BBC.
exactly. You are asking too much of people. And I think there is this notion, and I've spoken about it before, that I find it, kind of condescending that an organization like the BBC gives the facts and the people that have kind of, got the wrong end of the stick say, oh my gosh, thank you so much. I was waiting for this all along. And it was you. Thank you, sir. Thank you. Now I will go along on my merry way, understanding everything. It's like, don't be ridiculous. People, as you say, if it's simple, people use it. And if you want to know, oh gosh, I don't know, who your local councillor is, and you Google it and the first thing that pops up, you're like, great, that'll do. Or if you're, a kid and you go onto TikTok to do it, that's fine, that'll do. It's good enough. And I think, once again, fishing where the fishes are, you've got to speak the language, and you've got to be in the places where people are to find that information. You have to be useful. And the stone sort of tablets that come down from on high, not anymore. So I think that, there is, of course, a place for the absolute sort of chapter and verse. We know that people are interested in deep dives. We know that people are interested in, long form stuff. But at the same time, people also have to be able to find it quickly. And if they can't find it quickly from the BBC, they will find it elsewhere, which is how you get these incredibly bright, able, curiously minded folk getting pulled into conspiracy theories, because actually the good information isn't readily available to them. Once again, we're sort of in this position where, you're talking about, the difference between people just repeating the same thing with kind of, with confidence and certainty. Because, sorry, I'm jumping about a bit, but if you look at, for example, climate change, the climate scientists, of course, they've got the correct science, but the way that they explain it is so sort of, equivocal, and, it's sort of on one hand, but on the other and everything.
Because they're scientists, right?
Because they're scientists, exactly. So they want
yeah.
to be absolute. If there's 1% chance, it's like, well, we can't be totally sure that. And the climate deniers come on and they're just like, no, Walla, this is the fact. So, you have to be bold about saying, these are the facts, and you have to be absolutely kind of, ready to stand up and do them. And it's why Keir Starmer, bless him, people are not drawn to him, because he's so reasonable.
It's so funny you say that. I mean, when working on brands, one of the things you are trained to do as you're doing research is to make judgments based on the information that you have, right? And there's a point at which you have enough information to do that, and it's good. And you say, right, this is the way forward. This is the path. And everyone does say, thank you. Okay, right, we are going to do this. We have enough evidence to move on. When I started working on public sector and government and NGO work, I had to train myself out of that because I found that if I stated something saying on balance of probabilities, this is what we should do. We go, well, but what about?
Yeah.
And you get stuck in the diagnosis of things and you never actually address the problem at hand.
It strikes me that there needs to be a whole cultural shift, really, in academia, in broadcasting, in what I would call loosely the intelligentsia, in that they need to be much more bold, that they can't be equivocal on anything. And that's really hard because the whole point of it is questioning what has happened.
Yeah. We have to accept that there's things we can't necessarily know, but that making a bold decision is about making a leap into that unknown, right? If you stick with the things you do know, you might never actually fix anything.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that if you look at the BBC, it's been really kind of dragged down by this. You're obliged as part of the Ofcom code to show due impartiality when you're dealing with a situation or an issue. And in the past, that word due has kind of been forgotten about. So, you look back to Brexit and you look back to climate change coverage, and it was completely wildly incorrect. They were giving weight to positions that actually, were not factually sustainable. Now it is more that they are going with the due impartiality, but there is still this kind of, on one hand, but on the other hand, and that is not what people are interested in nowadays. And that comes background to kind of understanding your audience, understanding the information ecosystem, and having that boldness to sort of say, we are going to put a viewpoint, and the other viewpoint will be covered elsewhere, in our coverage. But actually, we are putting this out without but these guys say this, because it just makes it kind of watery and neither hot nor cold, and it's not palatable to people.
Yeah. I'm going to pick up on that point, go back to conspiracy theories, because Stephen Lacey said something brilliant in our last episode that it is just really, it's on my mind. So one of the things that he said was that when in his interviews with people, there was a group of people who were basically conspiracy theorists, right? He said the really funny thing that he didn't expect is they're actually the people who are super intelligent, right? When you start talking to them, they're the ones who bring up Aristotle's cave. I think we'll play this clip probably, James.
These are middle-class people, very intelligent. When you do groups with them, they often talk about Aristotle's kind of cave.
Yeah.
And they would talk about the art of kind of war. And you think, oh my God, this is such an intellectual conversation. And then they go into conspiracy theories. 2030,
Yeah.
we're going to be completely ruled. We're going to be chips. We're going to be like China. We're going to have a social contract. It just goes on and on. Really brought in by kind of COVID. A lot of them middle-class women, actually, where their kids have kind of gone. And they don't have much to do. So they tend to be on kind of the Facebook, often brought in through new age ideas. Interesting thing about them is they're actually reading the most media sources, which is really interesting, because conventional wisdom is that the more you read, you get cognitive dissonance, but they go through the lens there's no truth. And if you go through the lens of no truth and you look at BBC and then you look at The Guardian, and then you look at the Daily Mail, right? And then you look at Tommy Robinson's stuff, you kind of get hooked in.
There's a tension there, right? Because the main tenet of media literacy is read widely, right? Check multiple sources. I mean, there's so much more in there, but the number one thing is, use as many sources as possible. But that seems to be also fueling a little bit of this, whataboutism, or, well, my fact is this different to this fact. And people then try to fill in the gaps. What is your experience of that with a conspiracy theorist? And then also, how can you address this from a media standpoint?
Yeah, I mean, I really get cross when people sort of say people have fallen for disinformation, or, they might think that, but it wouldn't possibly happen to me. We all believe disinformation.
Oh, yeah.
All the time. I fell for something last week, which was I guess now AI generated footage of the sign coming down off the Kennedy Center. When there was this stuff going around that was taking the Trump stuff off. And I was like, oh, and then I was like, oh no, I don't think it's true, because I wanted to believe it. We absolutely, all of us believe, disinformation, and, there's a variety of reasons for that. We've got this truth default theory kind of process in our brain that means we have to trust people. Otherwise, you'd never go out the front door. And so you are drawn to that. But conspiracy theorists, absolutely, I would completely agree with what Stephen said. They are people who have got curious minds, who ask questions and don't believe what they're told. And that is a useful position and a perfectly reasonable position to come from. As journalists, we're pretty cynical. We're like, no, I don't think so. And some of the, most powerful investigations that have ever been is because people didn't believe what they were being told. But there is a point at which, and sadly, algorithmically, you just keep getting pushed this stuff if you start exploring. That, if you're trying to find stuff, answers to, where did COVID start or whatever, it is very, very easy to start getting sort of, pulled down this rabbit hole. And with sources, it's about, who is the source, well, is it a credible source or not? So, but again, we are asking quite a lot of people. And I think that this kind of confirmation bias also plays a huge part in it, because, if you are facing a situation like COVID, where you really want to think there's reasons behind it, because frankly, if we find out what's behind it, we can perhaps stop it happening again. And so there's a real kind of natural pull to find that. And then you start seeing things which say, oh, maybe it came from this lab. And then, of course, if you're reading it, the algorithm goes, oh, you like that? Here's some more of it. And here's some more extreme stuff, because all they want to do is keep you on the platforms so they can sort of push adverts at you. And so you then find like-minded people that say, oh, I was confused as well, but actually I think, this is, legitimate, and this is, something that people are trying to hide from us, and we found it, and again, in the same way that as journalists, you get that little kind of buzz of, oh, crikey, I found something. And that, again, is a real sort of natural human emotion that will kind of pull you into that and keep you finding more. So, yeah, I would say that conspiracy theorists are, bright, able people that simply want answers, which is why we need to have a situation where when they're looking for answers, the trusted sources, the reliable sources are kind of put to the top and produced and available in an engaging, accessible, interesting way. We need to learn from the bad actors. We need to learn from the way that they have done things before and use some of those techniques in order to kind of put the accurate information across.
I got in contact with you because of the chat that you had with Amil Khan, which we'll link to in the show notes, which I thought was really interesting. And you made this point about using the tips that the bad actors do in order to try to get to people. Just explain a bit more exactly about what you mean by that. Like, what kind of things should we be doing? What kind of dastardly plans have they been using that we should definitely be going for now? In the name of good. I'm trying to make this kind of superhero.
They publish them too, which is helpful for everyone.
Yeah.
Yes, exactly. I rather like this kind of like Marvel universe type of thing where we're all, I don't know what I'd like to be within that. But anyway, the techniques they use are peer-to-peer. So you're talking as one human being to another human being. They pull on the levers which have got to do with, these are things to do with your children. These are things to do with your health. These are things to do with your domestic situation. It is people that are speaking. It is not an institution that is speaking. It is compelling. They are human stories. They are on the platforms that you are on because you're interested in whatever. They repeat the same message over and over again. It's the techniques that, I was trained as a broadcast journalist. It's the techniques that I was taught as a broadcast journalist. And that's the sort of thing that you have to do. So it's not some sort of, weird sort of alchemy or black magic or whatever. It is sort of quite sort of sensible things, but it is extraordinarily things that institutions don't do. So you still get situations where you have, for example, earthquake or a hurricane or, something awful has happened. And then you've got all of this stuff, which is, put out, which is AI generated, or people, putting up footage from video games and so on and so forth. And then to kind of counteract that, you get, a chap in a suit standing in front of a police station or whatever, wildly wide shot, so you can't kind of tell, and rubbish sound, sort of saying, well, we don't quite know the reason for this, but, can you please all sort of stay in your houses and this sort of thing. And you just think, oh, for heaven's sakes, no, that is not the way to go about it. Find somebody who is absolutely on the front lines, who's doing something interesting, get the camera, move the camera about, saying, this is what we're doing. Tell the story. This is what we're doing. We're telling stories to each other, and use some of those techniques that they use, so incredibly effectively.
I think there's a couple of things I've noticed in what you just said, Rebecca, which is that, so firstly, one of the things that James and I have talked about is, I think James, you'd received some training where you were told to say you a lot because that's about making it personal. But what you're saying, which I think is probably closer to the truth, is that personal is understanding what matters to people, not talking directly at them. And that's a mindset shift for the BBC, right? Like, it's not big issues and then adding you into it or trying to add a line to it. It's actually, what are the things that people care about and how do you bring that out?
Yeah, and it's we. I mean, particularly. And I think it's really the kind of the blessing and the curse of impartiality is one of the things here, because impartiality is really important because, it means that, you can be trusted. But on the other hand, it can distance you from what's really going on. And actually, some of the, most impactful reporting that happens is when you get Clive Murray on the front lines of Ukraine, or people who are kind of actually in the midst of the earthquake in Turkey, explaining how she and the camera operator were like sleeping in their car because they were affected by it as well. Yeah. So, you can't do it all the time, but actually when you say, we are going through this as well, it is very, very effective.
Completely. There's a potentially very powerful thing that can be done there. I think the other thing is that, we haven't touched on it here, but that for all the criticism of BBC, there's a reason that its branding, its colors, its name gets stolen all the time by misinformation actors to be attached to misinformation. It's because there is some latent trust there. And also for all the other things that, people don't like change, they don't really want to change the source of their information. It helps them to do that. There's a body language of trust that it feels like is being overlooked in some way.
Yeah, I think you're right. And I mean, it is, no coincidence that the BBC's viewing figures, user figures absolutely shot up during COVID, because when something dreadful happens, that is still where people turn to, increasingly because people are not watching linear TV, although they did actually return to it during COVID. But then I think that's because everyone was trapped in their houses. That's another thing. But, during times of crisis, I think this is something that the government's talking about, how rather than it just being business as usual for the search engines or for the algorithms, that actually they should be promoting, for example, Radio Shropshire, if there's been a flood in Shrewsbury or something like that, because, these are the trusted news sources that actually people should be able to find easily. Because, as you say, it's where people, do naturally turn to when they really want sort of, to know really what's actually going on, because of that latent trust that is still within a lot of people. But it won't be within the next generation unless, the BBC either pushes itself into these new places or is promoted and kind of pulled up by the tech giants.
Should they be investing more at a local level? If we're thinking about this as having to be personal as well, building personal relationships, you can't do that from behind a desk.
So look, I mean, my view is that the two kind of crown jewels of the BBC, the World Service and local radio, which is a kind of wildly bizarre viewpoint.
Okay, so this is the bit I can jump in. So I was editor of World Business Report and Business Matters on the World Service, and then for many years before that, I was at GNS, which was the general news service for local radio, largely, and I spent years in local radio. I always said to people that there was much more closeness between the World Service and local radio than actually there was with national radio. And the reason for that, as odd as it sounds, is if you are, and I'll take my old patch, which is Lincolnshire, as an idea. Lincolnshire's quite a big patch. So if you are in Lincoln, for example, quite a big place, and you're hearing a story about Boston, that's quite a long way away in your local area. So you don't really care about it. So you've got to make whatever story you make about Boston relevant to the rest of Lincolnshire somehow. In the same way, if you're listening in Singapore, but there's a story about Afghanistan, you need to make that relevant to the wider audience. So I've always thought in that way, actually, the two are really quite similar.
Yeah, I completely agree. I started at Radio Newcastle, or Radio Newcastle, as I used to have to call it,
of course.
because
the
of
Pink
my...
Palace.
The Pink Palace, yes, oh, you remember it. Yeah. And then when I sort of ended up after a very sort of circuitous route at World Service Languages, I was like, oh, this, yes, it was really, really familiar for exactly that reason. And I think that, it's local people talking to local people is also, an important point. All of the emphasis, certainly within the BBC itself, is on the national bulletins and, the national, radio stations. But actually, the relationship that most people have is with their local radio stations. And I also worked in regional TV. And I mean, you have never seen kind of adulation like it than when the Look North presenters were sort of fated as gods wherever they went. And actually, when I was running the Global Disinformation team, I had a team in Nigeria. And, they were sort of treated in the same way. They were talking to their community that they came from. And so there was that absolute, particularly the work that we were doing, there was this kind of passionate sense of mission and commitment to get these stories out to people who were their family and their friends and people who were kind of absolutely like them. So I think that sense of passionate commitment to getting the stories out there is really, really similar in the World Service as it is with local radio. So I find it extraordinary that, I hear once again, the World Service is being cut or the local radio is being cut. I was like, to what? It is so thinly resourced as it is. And they work absolute miracles, both sort of global to local ends of the spectrum. If I had the purse strings, I would be investing in both of them.
Let's just finish then by asking this. If somebody is through the rabbit warren at this point, if they believe in the vaccines are bad or they believe in 5G being a problem or climate change or whatever, is there a way back, do you think, for them from that position?
I'll answer kind of in two ways. From a BBC perspective, we were asked quite a lot about how we reach those people. And my view is that the people we were trying to reach are the people who are still asking questions. And actually, if you've gone so far down the rabbit hole that you are probably not even listening to the BBC or, accessing it in any way, then there are other ways to do it. But you need to make sure that the information is there so that if people kind of come back up, they can find it. If you're talking about people in your life who have suddenly started or maybe incrementally started talking about these things, ask them why they believe these things, listen to them. The worst thing you can do is say, no, you're wrong. It just doesn't work. People will double down. If you just think of anything that you're arguing in the pub about the person that scored the winning goal in the FA Cup final in 1977 or whatever, you will fight to the death to say that it's one thing or the other. And, and then that's only football. Dare I say that for somebody that works at Five
Football
Live?
is everything. It's everything. People care so much more about this than anything else.
We
can't lose sight of that, right? Like this is...
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And if you're then talking about something which kind of speaks to someone's core values, so their sort of faith or their health or their children or whatever, it's even more so people just double down on it. So I would say listen and find out, not like, why do you believe that? But, oh, that sounds interesting. Tell me about it. Because it is that sort of, people think about these quite a lot. And the only way that you can ever get through to somebody is by engaging them in conversation, finding out why they think things, and sort of, trying to get to the bottom of it. It's not a cult. You're not trying to sort of, to pull somebody out of it, but you're about trying to have a relationship with that person so that, perhaps gradually, eventually you can start sort of, encouraging them to read other things, to consider other options. But the key thing is to listen to people.
That was Rebecca Skippage. She was formerly the BBC's Global Disinformation Editor and lots of other things. And Claire, Rebecca and I had a quick chat afterwards because you had to run away quite quickly after that interview. We had a quick chat, as you do, in a kind of, oh, you're a former BBC person. Well, who do you know? And anyway, we were talking about the kind of effects on local media and regional media. She mentioned in that, about trying to safeguard local media and the World Service as well, and the way that we kind of measured the two up. And I thought what came out of that whole conversation was, I agreed with her on an awful lot. The thing I didn't necessarily agree on was about whether you think you should still have Strictly Come Dancing. And do you know what? I cannot stand Strictly Come Dancing. I have always...
That makes two of us.
...hated it.
Yeah.
With a visceral passion. And
okay, don't hate it, but okay.
Well, if you've had to play that bloody music on numerous radio programs through the years and go, it's Strictly Come Dancing this week, why don't we talk to this dance? I don't care. And I never have. But I think there is a role for programs like that gets incredibly undervalued, because people need to look at things like the BBC and say, it's for me in one way or another.
Yeah,
and I think
I agree.
actually, if they don't do that, then I think we are in the situation where people will just switch off entirely.
I agree with you partially. So I think I'm a halfway point between you and Rebecca, where I agree they need to exist. What I don't agree with is that they need to be held at the BBC in perpetuity. So from my perspective, when I look at the creative industry in the UK as a whole, that's a huge part of what we talk about. And, you know, when we're talking about our information ecosystem, that's held up by entertainment. Now, British entertainment is in a bit of a crisis because Netflix isn't filling that gap. ITV and Channel 4, their budgets are under enormous strain. I think that there is a role for the BBC in nurturing these programs until they're big, a little bit like what happened with Bake Off, right? Like there should be more Bake Offs that start at the BBC, get nurtured into existence, create formats that can be distributed globally. But when they're at that stage, get passed to something like a Channel 4 or to an ITV or to a Netflix, right? To then continue on, because that's a really big part of our creative ecosystem. It's also a really big part of our creative economy. It's a big part of our information ecosystem as well.
Then who keeps the rights? Because, you know, the BBC actually gets loads of money from Strictly Come Dancing, having sold it as Dancing to the Stars and whatever. Same with things like Top Gear, right? Top Gear was a brand that was on the BBC for 40, 50 years beforehand. It became this massive thing. It's currently on hiatus. But then you've got the problem of, you know, they could then license that around the world. And that's one of the ways that the BBC is trying to make money at the moment, is by licensing this stuff around the world, selling it. And that puts more money back into the pot to make these programs again, because the costs are just so astronomical.
Yeah,
otherwise.
but the costs are astronomical because you're making global programs, right? This is where there's that trade-off between what's in the interest of the UK public and what's in the interest of the licensee payer, and also our information resilience. And at what point does it become, you know, the point which you have to let it go? Like Doctor Who is too big for the BBC now, right? Like they can't make it. They had to kind of, you know, jostle someone into helping them, right? I can't remember. Was it Disney now who's
but
stepping
yes,
in?
it was Disney, and then that whole deal disappeared. But of course, the problem there is that you're then saying you know the BBC should lose its IP over time, which I would say the problem with that is that, you know, once it's gone, and secondly, the whole point is that IP becomes massive and makes money again for the BBC. Look, I don't think there's an easy answer here by any stretch, and I get your point entirely. But I think that was the thing that I took from what Rebecca was saying, and I think there is a question there about universality. Like, we either decide that we want the BBC because everybody has a stake in the BBC and therefore it's for everybody, or it becomes some sort of subscription niche thing. And as a former BBC person, I get all the problems with it, but for me, the fact is that I still wanted it to be the case that, you know, if something major happens, like, we're speaking today, the Prime Minister has just gone, everyone can turn to the BBC and find out what's going on. And that to me always wanted to be the situation.
I mean, I think the problem is that where the BBC, that effort they put into Strictly, that's putting it into event television that doesn't exist anymore in that way. Where event television is sports. You know, we did that NFL episode. That's where that is. I think there's probably a case that if they wanted to make money doing some kind of deal where they're able to retain some value from sports, putting that in there is also a good idea. I think, but there is a balance that has to be struck, because the entertainment economy that the BBC grew up in just isn't there anymore.
Well, I agree with that. And unfortunately, they got rid of Television Centre, which I've run around late at night for a laugh, and it was quite good fun. I mean, it's an amazing place. It really was. But there we go.
Now it's an amazing Soho House.
Yeah, I know.
I know. Isn't that just...
It's really quite depressing.
It is.
Anyway, look, I think the point is, you know, it depends who you ask in the BBC as to what should happen next. It depends who you ask across the media. Everybody has got their own opinion. It's a bit like with education. Everyone's got their own idea of what the BBC was to them, so therefore they have a different perspective on it. That's what I think. Anyway,
that's fair.
Look, I thought it was really interesting. If you want to get in touch with us, you can do talk more about that episode or any other episode indeed. hello@canwehaveyourattention.com.
Yes. And before we go, there's something I wanted to mention as well. So at the moment, there is a really important bill that's going through Parliament. The final amendments are being voted on. It's the Representation of the People bill. I believe I talked about this a couple of weeks ago, James.
You did?
So reform political advertising, not related to reform at all, but actually predates them, a neutral advocacy body that's advocating for the reformation of political advertising so that it's fact-based, it's regulated, the same standards that you apply to normal advertising in the UK gets applied to election information. The campaigners that lead this organization have done absolutely incredible work in getting cross-party parliamentary support. This is, ironically, aside from reform, every other political party has signed up to this and has supporters of the amendments to this bill that relate to the dissemination of electoral information that it should be fact-based, right? It sounds obvious. Apparently it's not. Anyway, there is a limited amount of time to get more supporters for this bill, and Reform Political Advertising have set up a website where you can email, it's pretty much automatically done, your MP to ask them to support those amendments that advocate for fact-based political advertising. This is incredibly important for people's belief in the integrity of elections and the integrity of information. So please, in the show notes, there's a link to the website. Please do sign up and email your MP to ask them to support the amendments to this bill.
Indeed. Thank you. Our little misinformation and disinformation arc will be continuing for at least a couple more episodes. You and I are going to have a chat next time. And then we're going to be hearing from Sam Stockwell, aren't we, hopefully, all about what he's doing at the Turing Institute. Claire, thank you. A pleasure.
Thank you, James.